Hi, everyone. Welcome to the very last session on this two-day International Congress on Racism and Discrimination organized by Multihuri. The name of the current session is Inherited Racism, a historical sociological analysis of the persistence of racism in contemporary multicultural Italy. It is a pleasure to have the three experts in the field today with us. I will introduce the three of them now, as they will be presenting and discussing the issues together. They'll have a vast expertise in the field, so I will do my best trying to summarize their views. First, we will have Gugia Gilardoni. She's a modern history graduate from the University of Bologna, and she holds a PhD in sociology and social research methodology from the Università Cattolica del Sacro Cuore in Milan. She's also International Research Project Manager at the ISMU Foundation, where she's in charge of international relations, and she's a member of the Board of Directors at the External Affairs Committee of INISCOE and at the Anti-Racism Working Group. Then we'll have with us Marta Visioli, a PhD student in Sociology, Organizations and Cultures at the Università Cattolica del Sacro Cuore in Milan as well. She holds a master's degree in international relations and cooperation. She has collaborated as a researcher at its time within the Department of Sociology at the Università Cattolica del Sacro Cuore, taking part in a project aimed to support the Oromo ethnic community. Then, lastly, we'll have Maria Grazia Santagati, a senior researcher at the Faculty of Education at the Università Cattolica del Sacro Cuore, Milan, where she also works as a professor of sociology of education and human capital politics. She's part of the board of directors at the Center of Initiatives for Research on Migration at the Università Cattolica del Sacro Cuore in Brescia, and works within the scientific committees of several book publishers and journals such as Open Sociology or the Italian Journal of Sociology of Education. So thank you very much, Gugia, Maria Grazia, and Marta. The floor is all yours.
Thank you. Many thanks, Nachos, for the nice introduction and mostly for the invitation of this really amazing conference. It has been a pleasure to listen and learn from the contributes of these 2 days. We're going to be the last, so we are trying to do our best in order to make it short and to leave some space for debate. Also, because after listening that much, people have lots of I guess a lot of questions and will to speak a little bit. So we are going to talk at least 15 minutes each, and then there will be the debate. Is it fun for you, Nachos?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you very much. Okay. So I start with sharing. Okay, thank you for the sharing. So yes, our contribution to this conference on racism and discrimination in 2021 is aimed at presenting the situation in Italy underlying the historical roots of contemporary racism. And my contribution is on the first part of our title, Inherited Racism, where this is meant to bring the attention on racism as an historical phenomenon, while Marta and Maria Grazia will present the current situation from a sociological perspective. Marta talking about women and Maria Grazia about education. So let me start saying that in Italy, racism is something which is not debated as much as it happens. Over the last years, there have been many empirical evidence of structural, institutional, and individual racism. But nonetheless, there is almost no public debate at this regard. And when it happens, when we debate, it's more like a sort of an abrupt awakening in reaction to some unexpected incidents, instead of a critical thinking and self-reflexive process. So it is like racism is something that is not related to us, a sort of taboo, indeed. And there is also a lack of recognition of racism in the terms that I think we are all racist to some extent, but we are definitely not seeing it. And this is part of the powerful, of the power that that racism is built on. And even in the academic discourse, there is a gap between a wide range of studies, for instance, in migration studies, and the lack of application of the notion of races and racism. So racism as an enduring structural force in contemporary social world is almost ignored, while race still plays a central role in contemporary migration regimes in the forms of control and security used to govern people on the move. And this is particularly true in the Italian context. So my attempt here today is to give a pitch, at least a few examples of some forms of racism that are in place in Italy, looking at the recent past, with the aim to show the continuity of racism through at least the last century. And the idea is to propose a way to look at the current racism through an historical perspective in order to contribute to the awareness raising about the present and the historical continuity of Italian racism. So such an exercise would have required much more effort than what I have been able to do since now. So please take it more as a research agenda than a research result. In preparing this presentation, I have been inspired mostly by the advocacy made by the Italian Black Lives Matter movement, which invites to reconnect the colonial past to the present, and also from the reading of Migration Studies and Colonialism by Maebling and Tanner. The next slide. Oh, sorry. Okay, so why to look at racism as an historical phenomenon? Being a core cultural aspect of Western societies since at least 3 centuries, 4 if we consider its genesis, racism should be considered as an historical phenomenon, meaning that there was a time when racism was not there because it was not necessary. Its emerge is strongly related to the building of the European nation states and the need of moral legitimacy, allowing European peoples to affirm that all human beings are equal and entitled of human rights, as happened during the Enlightenment era, while at the same time continuing to depredate and exterminate other populations worldwide. So we have a time where racism was not, and then a time where racism began to be there and is still there. For me, there are at least 3 good reasons to consider racism as an historical phenomenon. The first is that considering contemporary racism through the historical lens allows to detect the real danger of the process in place, without underestimating what we are facing, even with the new forms of racism. Yesterday, Angela has mentioned these new forms of racism in terms of populism, but also she was claiming that we are not yet juridically equipped in regard to the exponentially increasing power of algorithms ruling many aspects of our daily lives, for instance. And if you would like to have a look at an amazing docu-film that is called Coded Bias, where it is presented how algorithms are affecting and reinforcing some invisible exclusion process in our daily life. The second reason is that considering racism as an historical phenomenon permits to avoid representing it as a natural, irreversible, and inherent human attitude, and rather conceive it as an historical element of our cultures that can be counteracted and hopefully even overcome. And third, by considering racism through an historical perspective, it is also possible to look at its continuity through the time, which lead to a better recognition and understanding of contemporary forms of racism. I was really fascinated by the presentation, the previous presentation by Letizia, and usually I ask myself, why are we at this point? Why we have conceived such a set of rules and so on? So I think that if we look at history, there are at least some answers there. So today racism in Europe is expressed mostly against migrants, and we would be able to better understand how this happened and how it works by looking at the past. Because before being immigration countries, all European countries were immigration ones, and towards other parts of the world, where dominions were built on genocides and epistemicides. So when European countries started to become immigration countries, a racialized idea of the other was already there. And the other was already conceived as inferior, separate, and not equal, to some extent, not even human. And yes, it is true that we have good legislation, but the implementation of this good legislation is something that is still at stake. The administrative and juridical apparatus implemented in general by the European nation states in particular, and now we're talking about Italy, for the governance of migration and specifically for the reception and the so-called integration of migrants, was retailored starting from the old dress of the colonial administrative and juridical system. Probably that did not happen on purpose. I'm not saying that, but the truth is that it happened. So even if Italy had a quite brief and contained colonial history, by the way, it was enough. It was enough to ground a series of practices and discourses that can be still found in contemporary political discourses and public attitudes. Okay, so let's have a look at the historical heritage of Italian racism. Italian colonialism started in the late 19th century, and there start Italian racism too. But it was mainly under the fascism period that racism became a clear strategy to legitimate colonial domination and build Italian identity as a people that at that time was still very fragmented. So here you have an example of from the second book of the fascists. The first and the second book of the fascists were two little books used as teaching materials in schools, where we have a clear compendium of the perfect races. Italians here are defined as belonging to the Aryan race, and in the chapter "What do I need to know about race?" There is an interesting Q&A session that you can read by yourself here, which is an example of how racism has been taught as a self-evident reality through tautological thinking for at least 4 years in every Italian school, following the brainwashing style of dictatorship that was empowered by authoritarian personality of Mussolini. So who are you? You are an Italian. Which race you are? You are Aryan. You are superior. You have not to mix with any other. Otherwise, your values as a man, physically and spiritually, will be blurred into something horrible. So that was the message. And there is the strong historical heritage in which racism is deeply rooted. It is what Mussolini clarified himself pretty well. He was clarifying the essence of racism. It was almost 83 years ago. It's a lifetime, it's not that much. When Mussolini stirred up the crowd in a massive event in Trieste, claiming that the Jews issue is only an aspect of the phenomenon, of the racism phenomenon. He was saying that racism is in relation with the empire conquest. And that day he was shouting to the crowd, "History made us aware that empires are conquered by force of arms, but are kept through prestige. The maintenance of prestige is possible only through a clear and severe racial consciousness, establishing not only differences, but very clear superiority. And I think that this is crucial in the recognition and understanding of nowadays racism in Italy, where the idea of prestige of Mussolini is what is now called the racial privilege of being white. Italian people racism, which is told to be based on the fear of the other, is much more based on the need of feeling prestigious and the will to keep the privilege. Inside of the structure of domination based on the need of feeling prestigious and inside of the structure of domination that is created and maintained through racism, being white is an absolute privilege, guaranteed through the maintenance of a social space hierarchically superior, where the differences of gender and class are mitigated by the privilege of being white. And it is not difficult to see how these perfectly match within our contemporary economic and social system. And it is interesting to see how, over the years, the Lega Party has developed its communication skill, passing from a quite odd anti-migrants political propaganda from 2006, where they were provoking Italians to feel like natives from America be invaded and then destroyed by immigration with the paradigm of invasion, through something that and at that time it was not effective at all, that kind of message, because for Italian people it was not their feeling to be victims of an invasion, although the political were often presenting the reality in that way. But then they pass to a very much more effective slogan that is prima gli Italiani, Italiani first. And moving from that odd manifesto to the very effective slogan, Salvini have been able to successfully endorse a well-rooted public feeling of prestige, of self-defense, of the privilege, of the prestige. So this is the first example, and I'm trying to build up the line between the way Mussolini was building his propaganda on this new idea of Italian identity, and how it took a while for the actual politician to take that back. But when Salvini did it, unfortunately, he did it greatly, and it works a lot, because this is the rhetoric that is really effective nowadays in our country. I have also a second example, which is focused on the adoption of a set of norms and rules excluding part of the population. As highlighted by the jurist Clelia Bartoli, when Italy became a country of immigration, the legislation adopted to regulate the new phenomenon was not primarily intended to allow newcomers to participate as equals. On the contrary, legislation and policies have built the minority of the migrants through a hierarchical set of legal statuses regulating access to services and rights. And Letizia before was very clear on that. So this comes from the colonial past, which indeed was brief but strongly significant. How this went. If we look at how the administrative racist system in Italy developed in the past, it is remarkable to see that it took just 2 years to transform from something to be used far away in the colony, towards the others, to something to be fiercely applied to those who since the day before were considered Italian citizens as the Jews. Because it was in 1936 that the bureaucratic colonial system started the creation. But then it was just in 1938 when we adopted the racial law and starting to, let's say, persecute the Jewish people. This happened to be as a bureaucratic and administrative process, both in the colony against natives in Italy and in Italy against Jews, following the same identical logic: to classify, to separate, to exclude, and then exploit or exterminate. And remarkably, this came to be, this administrative implementation happened in the complete silence of the civil societies. And this is something similar to the indifference we are facing nowadays toward contemporary forms of racism. I'm not comparing this situation in terms of similarity of what happened in the colony and during the fascist dictatorship to what is going on in regards of migrants inclusion, because this would have not been appropriate at all. But rather, I'm suggesting that the logic the Italian administrative system is using today is affected by what happened in the past and what administrations did in the past. Again, maybe this is not done on purpose, but this is what is happening. So to recall what Maria José Aguilar was saying yesterday morning about the fact that for build a real anti-racism institution should recognize the existence of institutional racism. If there is a chance that institutions start to recognize the institutional racism, this should start by the recognition of its historical roots. Unless we are not able to move from the taboo we are living now in Italy regarding all these issues and living in a sort of false self-consciousness, pretending that racism does not exist, or if it exists, it is extremely marginal and accidental. We are really not able to be to counteract and to tackle and to cope with a persistence of racism that is really affecting our societies. So I stop here and give the floor to Marta now. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Guia, for this insightful historical approach that helps us understand, the idea of inherited racism in Italy right now. Mm-hmm. And we'll now have with us Marta. Marta, the floor is all yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nacho, for your introduction, and thank you, Guia, for your presentation, which allows me to introduce the theme that I will present. I will focus within the contextualization Guia made in her presentation on the intersectionality between race and gender in Italy as particular forms of racism against foreign women. First of all, a quick table of the context I will explain. I will start by introducing the discriminations against foreign women in the Italian context, in particular with reference to the space of not being, where women are excluded and are constrained to live. And in particular, I will present some data to prove the presence of these discriminations. Secondly, we will see how these intersectional discriminations take place not only in the space of not being, but also at the border between inclusion and exclusion. In this section, we will see in particular some forms of institutional racism against foreign women and why is racism against them still going on in Italy. And lastly, in the third section, we will see how these women can face against these forms of discrimination through their agency, and they can transform the so-called negative intersectionality into a positive intersectionality. So we will see some stories of inclusion and how to cope in practice with racism. First of all, it is important to distinguish between two main definitions of discriminations related to foreign women. First of all, we have multiple discrimination that occurs when a person is discriminated against because of more factors, but each discrimination occurs in different moments, so not simultaneously. While intersectional discrimination, which developed through African American feminism, occurs when a person is discriminated against on more factors that interact together, so they can't be any more separated. And in particular, we will see intersectional discrimination in the Italian culture, which have been thematized by Gaia Giuliani and Cristina Lombardi Diop, which focus on the interplay between racism and sexism, and in particular in discriminations connected with the colonial legacy that we explained very well. So in the specific case of foreign women, we have a contraposition between the racial identity of white women and the subordinate black identity of the women from colonial East Africa. And this contextualization of discrimination try to deconstruct the concept of global sisterhood. And post-colonial feminism is one literature, one kind of literature that is trying to deconstruct this concept. And within this framework, foreign women live in many social spaces of not being in Italy. From some study, we have, first of all, the so-called ghettoization of foreign women in specific jobs. Then we have the lack of social spaces for them, no access to housing and social services, the trafficking of foreign women, and the violence against foreign women, which can be perpetrated both from employers or also in the street or on the buses. This is an image that clearly explains the concept of intersectionality. In this case, we see the intersection between race and gender empower the power dynamics of race. So the concept of race became, in some sense, more powerful. But there are different categories within intersectionality. And according to some Italian data, we can see how these intersectional discriminations are relevant today. First of all, in 2020, we know that foreign women in Italy are about 2.6 million, that is 51.8% of the whole foreign residents in Italy. And the main discrimination they suffer is discrimination within the labor market. As a matter of fact, if 50% of foreign population is concentrated in 13 jobs, foreign women are employed only in 3 jobs. That is domestic service, personal care, and cleaning service. And in particular, here there is a graph with data about the percentage of unemployed and inactive people of working age total residents in Italy. And the interesting point that shows the intersectional discrimination is that the foreign women are the women with the higher rate, almost 50% of inactivity, and also the highest rate of unemployment. So the interconnection between race and gender here determines a higher discrimination level. Here there are other data about the discriminations, but they are not statistic data, but data regarding the chronicles of racism against foreign women in Italy. I wanted to show you many episodes of racism, so I don't read all the episodes, but just to give you the idea of the actuality of this problem in Italy. And you can see from these parts that there are episodes of racism both in social life, but also in politics and in the media. For example, in this case, happened on May 2019, where Fatou Barolou, who is a candidate on the list Europa Verde, was covered with both sexist and racist insults on social networks just because she criticized the policies of the Interior Minister. And next to these forms of discriminations that we have seen take place within the spaces of not being, that is, the social spaces of exclusion, sometimes there are forms of discrimination which are not so visible or are unconscious and are at the border between inclusion and exclusion, always in Italy. In this sense, it is very relevant, the case of some intercultural associations presented in a research of Erika Bernacchi in 2018. And from the interviews made to the migrant women, it emerged a gap between the mission of the associations and the concrete management of power within these associations. This means that migrant women were not involved into the association's dynamics, for example, in the transmission of knowledge from Italian to migrant women, and they suffered from unequal relationships. This is an important point because this means that sometimes discriminations are hidden, and sometimes there are some attempts of inclusion of migrant women in the space of being that can fail and that result in forms of exclusion. Another form of intersectional discrimination or discriminations in general that can occur against foreign women regard discriminations within institutions that refer to the broad area of institutional racism that Guia explained. And the interesting point is that institutional racism with a veiled exclusion together with structural racism, replicate these social spaces of not being. These spaces are also called by Ponencias fixed and unfixed spaces. They are spaces where immigrants, but also refugees and other minorities are excluded from social life. And in Italy, this form of institutional racism occur against foreign women, especially in free areas. In school, housing and employment policies, for example, the reduction of the school time can strongly disadvantage the employment of foreign women, especially those who can't resort to private structures. Then we have the lack and precarity of social interventions for the migrants in Italy. And this is a problem, especially for foreign women, because within migrants, women are very vulnerable categories together with children. And so the problem in Italy is that money is not invested and the social measures for inclusion don't have the form of the stable service. And finally, there is a concern between structural and institutional racism that is a kind of discrimination that is in between these two forms of racism, that is the segregation of foreign women to specific jobs, because sometimes policies are not so discriminating, but in practice, women can access some jobs and they have a lack of social mobility. And we will see now briefly why is racism again, still going on against foreign women. There are three main reasons. First of all, the legacy of colonial mentality. So we have the contraposition of Black women and white women, Black women considered as a colonial object, and also the emergence of today's political populism in Italy. Then we have a tendency of politics to minimize the racist incidents, especially against women, and this tendency is connected with the polarization of discourses against foreign women and migrants, especially in the web. So digitalization plays a key role in the spread of racism, especially against women, also with sexist and racist insults. As a matter of fact, the problem is that the hate speech online is forbidden, but the algorithm can't detect the hate speeches until the users point out them. Here I've written other important chronicles of racism, and in particular the case of Ajitu Gudeta, who was an Ethiopian shepherd in Trentino, and she suffered both from racism and feminicide, because she was killed, but she suffered also from racist episodes. And in the first section, we will see how foreign women can move, sometimes manage to move from the space of not being to the space of being, of inclusion. So through their agency, they can transform the structural conditionings, that is race, gender, social class, religion, into positive intersectionalities, into opportunities for cultural integrations. And we have two important cases. One case is that of intercultural associations in Italy. Some associations, not a lot, have a policy of positive discrimination. So they include foreign women in policy-making processes, and this allows women to emancipate. And then we have the case of Afro-Fashion Association, founded in 2015. This is very important because was an association made by Afro-Italian women who tried to change the narrative, both of Blackness and Italness. And through this association, Afro-Italian women managed to achieve more economic independence and also to engage in political causes for human rights. So in conclusion, if this inclusion is possible in Italy, but the permanence of racism against foreign women is still a relevant problem, how can we cope in practice with racism? There are two points to underline. First of all, in theory. In theory, it is important to apply a decategorization of women on the basis of nationality and the recognition of hybrid identities. So only in this way it is possible to create a female solidarity against racism. The only risk is the risk of color blindness, that is the risk of elimination of differences. But if there is the awareness of this risk, it is important to actuate this decategorization. And the second point is the sharing of power and of decision-making mechanisms with foreign women, as we have seen in intercultural association. But theory is not enough. As a matter of fact, it is important a change in practice. So in practice, these associations and organizations for human rights, for women's rights, need to have a strong focus on an effective promotion of the citizenship rights. So this is the key to change, because there is still a great separation between Italian and foreign women due to the structural asymmetry we have seen, and only widening, making the spaces for citizenships wider, it is possible to cope with racism in practice. Here there is some bibliography. And I thank you all for your attention. And now I leave the floor to Maria Grazia.
Thank you as well, Marta, for sharing those actual examples of intersectional discrimination in Italy and not being in Italy, those social spaces of exclusion in Italy for migrant women. So thank you very much. Now we'll have Maria Grazia with us. Maria Grazia, the floor is yours. Thank you.
I try to conclude this long speech with a focus on this link. I know you are very tired for these two very rich and intense days of reflection about racism in our country, but I try to do my a sort of reflexive and meta-reflexive exercise about racism and education in Italy. And I think that this is a good example of some of the paradoxes we have seen during this day. Because this is the hypothesis, the question. We have a very good legislation and we have a good model of inclusion of students with migrant background in our country. So there is a good legislation, but we don't have evidence about this issue. Does interculturalism eliminate or mitigate or coexist with discrimination and racism towards immigrant origin people? And I try to demonstrate that in some cases racism and discrimination persist, also in a very guaranteed framework, even in education. That is a very important playground for the application of interculturalism. Some word about the Italian model. I think the Italian educational system is very interesting for us because since the beginning, so since the 19th, it was designed as an inclusive and intercultural model. The meaning is that we have an universal access to the education system that is not dependent from the juridical condition of minors that have arrived in Italy. And so all the children with immigrant background, non-Italian children, or children with non-Italian citizenship, Letizia has shown very well, very in depth the situation about the question of the issue of citizenship, but non-Italian citizenship have the right, citizens have the right to access to the public education. Sure, there are, this is the theory and the juridical framework, but this model has limit in the translation to practices. There are not national policies that regulate this universal access with the norm and very strictly regulation. There are some local differences and there are a lot of difficulties for the access in practice for some targets as newly arrived children or unaccompanied minors or Roma children and so on. This inclusive model is combined with another model of integration, that is the intercultural model. And we know that Spain and Italy were the first countries in the south of Europe that try to apply this intercultural model. I don't want to define this idea, but sure, I think that in this model there are equal opportunities, recognition of differences, but also positive and horizontal and parity in the interaction among immigrant and natives. And this definition have to face with the challenges of the practices. So the limits of the model are many because immigrants maintain their disadvantaged status. And so to be an immigrant in the educational system, we can see in the next slide, it will be linked with significant educational inequalities, segregation, and also scarce excellence in their educational pathways. And there are not concrete and clear mechanisms for the recognition of diversities. So in some cases, there is a random presence, a casual presence of intercultural mediators. And in this period, there is a sort of crisis of the intercultural paradigm, and because there is a weak links between institutional policies and practices, but there is a big gap between educational policies and the other narratives and the other ideas, vision, and also measure applied in the immigration policies. I use a sort of mix of languages. I can use French and Italian and Spanish to keep your attention. But this is the clarification about what I was saying before. That there are ethnic inequalities, race inequality in education, and there are a lot of indicators about this in the characteristic of the pathway of students with immigrant background. Delay in their pathway, especially the newly arrived children and students show a big delay if compared with the Italian pupils. That means that they are not attending classes corresponding to their age. There is a very high rate of early school leavers among students with an immigrant background. There are a big group also of young people not in employment, education, and training, the so-called NEET, that are very overrepresented among non-Italian students, and so on. There are a lot of problems and dilemmas in the access, in the choices with the present, and the channelization in vocational institutes, and also in the result, in the performance, and in the presence of this group in the educational system that have to be explored more with the lens of race and ethnic inequalities. We have a big group of almost 1 million of students in our school system, from kindergarten to upper secondary schools, and we have a very integrated and structural immigration, with a majority of students that are already born in Italy. So the situation is not a condition of new arrivals, but it is a more complex situation. I try to report here two kind of sources to try to draw this frame about racism and school and education. And I have to say that there are no systematic data about this, and we can see later that there are also few studies, few research and investigation about this. We have only some data coming from ONG and other organizations that collect, already quoted by Marta, that collect chronicle of racism. We know that there are these are not scientific data, but I think that we can use this data to reconstruct narratives or the explicit fact, the denunciation and situation that emerge in the public opinion about racism. And in this figure, you can see some data are longitudinal data collected in these reports from 2008 to 2019. About racism in Italy, and this figure is about context areas in which there are some racist episode or discrimination on the racial basis. And you can see that there are some general the majority of the fact concern the public life, social relation, but we have also school. The total fact are almost 200, and sport and other contexts. I want to underline that school exists in this frame, and there are some cases in which also in school that seems to be the most guarantee protected environment. There are some cases of racism. I want to say also that the main victims of this ordinary racism as emerging in these narratives are mainly young people. We know that the immigrant population is very young, but there are also minors. 300, almost 400 cases, in fact, concerning minor. And the last figure concerns the actors, the author of these racist acts. And we can see that there are some oscillation along this period, this decade, and we can see that the institutional actors are the main authors of this racist act in 2014-2015. And then there is a sort of decline, but we know that this racism gradually increase if linked with individual act or racism. And we can see also this oscillation of sport, environment, and so on, that are involved in this kind of act. I try to reconstruct also a sort of picture about the last year. And I try to use the database of Daily Chronicle of Ordinary Racism using two keywords that are schools and minors, and I detect 133 facts. I want to highlight that in this group of events, we have 62 events that concern discrimination, especially no access or exclusion from school canteen, school bus, bonus, and so on. Cases that already Letizia quoted before. Some discrimination concerning ethnic school composition, so the segregation of separated classes in school. Of only immigrant students. 48 accounts and facts about verbal violence, and there is a lot of expression and example of bad words, teasing, insults, offenses, and also negative attitude as threat, provocation, aggressiveness, and so on, that are represented in these accounts. And 23 cases concerning physical violence, so concerning racist behaviors. I think that I take many times in my presentation, but English does not help me. And what can I add? I can add that from the side of this is from the side of some general data, impressionist data, but also from the side of research. I said, as I said before, racism and discrimination have been little investigated by Italian scholars, especially in education. And I think it's interesting to observe that these phenomena are often minimized and underestimated in educational environment. In general, are ascribed to variables such as social class or gender, but rarely explained in racial, ethnic, and cultural terms. We did with some colleagues some years ago a systematic review about race and ethnic inequalities on education, based building a database of many studies on this topic. And one of the four research tradition we identified was about interactive relationship. In this description, in this tradition, we identify some studies about ethnic discrimination, inter-ethnic contact, and conflict. What emerged from this these studies. I think that the main point I want to underline in this presentation is that there is also an hypothesis to be investigated in the future. There is a sort of generational divide. Because in the last year, we assist a sort of racialization and or ethnicization of school violence, school problem, and with the appearance of racial ethnic bullying in schools, in multicultural schools, and studies began to study to analyze a wide range of aggressive behaviors, such as verbal and indirect form of racism. And in this analysis, in these studies, it emerged a sort of generational divide. The students emphasize, so second generation immigrants emphasize the racial, ethnic, cultural nature of this tension. And these traits are considered very important as identity components. We can read something about the fact that it seems that this conflict on the racial basis, racial ethnic basis, this conflict are considered unacceptable for these young people. Adults, from their institutional point of view, so teachers and parents, so on, underline the material socioeconomic nature of the conflict, the tension among groups. And racism is not a question of interest, is an invisible issue at school, is under control. And so there is a sort of latent racism that is acceptable. I don't think I have many time to present the conclusion of my analysis, but I want to conclude with you reading. I'm a qualitative researcher. I do a lot of study with adolescent and student with immigrant background, and I collect a lot of stories. And for this intervention, I reread these stories, and I find this story that I think is quite a good example of what we are living and what we have to expect for the future of Italy in the comparison and in the exchange, in the conflict between generations. This is the story of Aisha, that is born in Italy. Its origins are from Senegal, and she is 17-year-old when she wrote this history autonomously. And she began with a self-presentation. She said, it is clear I have not Italian origin for my dark skin, so being Italian and being black. And she reconstructed the history of our school pathway. She said, the best period of my school life was kindergarten. I did not see the difference between my classmates and me. And my best friend were the only one that didn't see the difference between my color, my skin color, and their. And so only on primary school, I began to see this difference. For example, when she played with their classmates in primary school, she said, I always did the same roles. if they played with the wolf, I was the wolf. If the game was princess and king and queens, I had the best role, the servant. And she was very explicit in the denunciation of very hard word about children that from primary school added to our name the word not only black but nigger. And she denunciate also, for example, that in the photo classes they were always sitting at the side, and in the middle there were the white children, and at the side there was a sort of black patch. And she also did and repeated a lot of absurd questions they received are received in our history. I don't have the time to read this question. I think there are she said that there are absurd questions, but these questions are also legitimate in the context and in the school context in which she lived. I go to conclude, but I think that also this narrative is very important because allow us to conclude our discourse about inherited racism. Aisha said, many times I have heard people say that it was much better when Africans were our slaves than now that they arrived as refugees in our countries. So without any impulse or suggestion or induction, Aisha denounced this kind and found this kind of link that we think is very important to explicit. And so we have to also, as a researcher, to investigate, I think, this topic with new perspective that are able to comprehend better when, how, why these racist word, attitudes, and behavior take shape and develop. And I think that we have to also add to all our perspective also the generational and longitudinal perspective, considering visible and invisible dimension, but also said and non-said aspect. We don't we must not say that racism is a taboo or is not explicit, because Aisha teach us that there are accounts and tales and denunciation in which racist word, attitudes and behaviors are visible, are said, and are legitimate also in institutional context as school are. I hope.
Thank you, Maria Grazia. Thank you very much for your presentation and for explaining that that paradox within the education system and the gaps between immigration policies and education policies. So we will now open the room for discussion with the different questions that have been posted. And there are 3 questions right now. We may have more coming up. The first question is from Professor Albert Mora Castro, directed to Marta. He's asking, could you explain a bit more about those attempts of inclusion of migrant women from intercultural associations that lead to some forms of exclusion? Many thanks. Then we have Rocío Judith Canchari asking for all of you. Well, the first thing she's congratulating for your excellent presentations. And she's asking, how are migration policies implemented in relation with asylum in Italy in times such as these, with a higher influx of migrants, whether due to humanitarian crisis or due to cases such as Afghanistan? Are immigration policies in Italy progressive? And then we have one from Professor Ángeles Solares for Maria Grazia. In the field of racist context, you mentioned those that occur in public life. Could you please give us an example on how their management has been approached? So those are the questions. And,
I can start with the first question, if it's okay for you. Thank you very much, Albert. And thank you, Nacho. I think this is an interesting question because this is an interesting point, the case of intercultural association, because usually people don't think exclusion can occur in this organization, but it can occur sometimes in an unaware way, we can say. That is, the Italian women, in the case of intercultural associations in Italy, don't share their knowledge with the migrant women. So in that case, migrant women from the interviews were disappointed because they felt excluded. They felt excluded in the sense that they were considered always the vulnerable subjects and the subjects that need help. They were not involved in an active way, for example, in the policy making of the associations or in other activities. And this was one of the main points that emerged from the interviews. And there is another point. So some women said that Italian women are always as a guide. So they feel themselves as a guide for the migrant women. And this is another interesting point because it's linked in a certain sense with the colonial legacy. Because sometimes there is this unconscious feeling of helping the other, of being a guide, but sometimes this can be perceived in a negative way because these women were superior to the other, were acting in a superior way, and the other women didn't feel included in policy making and in the other activities of the organization. So we can say that these migrant women were the target and a kind of object also, we can say, not the subject of the initiatives of the associations.
Thank you very much. I think I said Guya before. Sorry, Marta, for that. So now we have the question. We have more questions coming up. We also have, I just wanted to say a comment by Albert Mora. Thanks for these 3 amazing and complimentary presentations. So if you want to continue with those questions I shared before, or do you want me to read them again, if you prefer? There was a question on immigration policies towards asylum in Italy and whether those immigration policies are progressive. I think it's an interesting question.
Yeah, if I may, I can answer on that. Yeah. So what we assist in Italy at this regard is it's a very crucial question because it brings into the attention the rights. Because when we talk about refugees, we are talking about people entitled of the right of being accepted and included into our societies. First of all, I would not frame the thing as a humanitarian crisis or something like that, because if we look at the number around the world, we as Europe is not receiving that many people. So it's much more a crisis of European values to the extent that we have to comply with what is declared in the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union in terms of shared responsibility and solidarity, while we are actually facing that we as nation states are not able to have a real shared responsibility. And actually the recent policies are criminalizing solidarity. So I would reframe it in this way. But what happened in Italy? We see that in Italy, the reception system is really over-institutionalized, meaning that we have implemented an apparatus, a system that it is there for the reception and inclusion, but actually it is excluding people because set them aside from the real society, with the idea of providing them with initial services that sometimes are in place, some other are not. But the system that has been adopted is not meant to really facilitate the entering of these people into our societies. It's just more like let them entering in a side space, something in between the space of being and not being that Marta was mentioning before. And if we look at this development, well, I don't see any good development in this regard. We had there has been detected also an emerging reception economies. We also had the chance to build a business on that, and that is part of the story that we can't underestimate. So because there are a lot of money dedicated to this, but how are we using that money? What are we exactly doing with that? Providing jobs for Italians mainly. And sometimes there have been also some scandals regarding the fact that what was supposed to do was not done in the best way, the best possible way. So I would hope for the future for having a more open and welcoming system in order to really favor and enhancing the inclusion of these people. There are some good examples for the humanitarian corridor. That is something that it works, and the private sponsorships. We are talking about very minor numbers, but that are good practices that we can look at and possibly forward implement. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Guia. Well, maybe we can now go to Maria Grazia's question, but maybe before, in advance, I can maybe share the other question we have from Victorino Domingo so that you can maybe think about it in the meantime. He congratulates your presentations, and he also, the question is, could you please share some practical examples of positive discrimination in gender? So I leave the question there. So if you could please, Maria Grazia, answer the question about an example of how the management of racist, I'm going to read the question because I'm losing it. In the field of racist context, you mentioned those that occur in public life. Could you please give us an example of how their management has been approached?
I don't know if I understand well the question, and there is in this in the figure I presented before, there is the areas of public or public life, and also education. The context of the education, environment of education is a public space. For example, I look for the last example. In this moment, there is non so come si dice, inchiesta, una investigazione, inchiesta. I don't know, inquire on a professor that called is student Scimmione, I don't know, Scimmione monkeys, big monkey, and with his classmate, and the Ministry of Education started with an inquiry in which he is going to verify this offense and this behavior towards an immigrant pupil. But I read some reaction about this episode, and for example, the line, the way to manage this situation is not to talk, not to discuss much about this. Try to insert to manage this kind of episode or situation within the institution. Without a lot of discussion in the public space or in the public opinion. And I think this is quite an Italian strategy to discuss. I think Guia knows more about this, but I have another example, but I've lost. Yes, another example that is quite different is the racist, the discrimination in the access of public education and compulsory education of a lot of minors that arrived between 12 and 14, 15 years. And we have observed that there are very different behavior of schools that reject a lot of expression, but they cannot reject. And when the public opinion emerge, denounce, or so there are some public reaction, or some cases in which there are some solution. But it is there is a sort of negotiation of these rights, also the rights of education, that in which we have we talk with Guia and Marta. We have some children that are our children. And then there are the children of the others that are not the same. But in the international frame of the right of the children, we know that is not in this way. So I don't know. It's a very complex situation and frame. I think we have to do a lot of research, and we have a lack of observatory or systematic collection of data. This is because there is not. We think that there is not a political and a social interest about this.
Thank you very much, Maria Grazia. And well, we have Victoria Domingo's question about, could you please share some practical examples of positive discrimination in gender?
Discrimination.
I think maybe Marta could reply to this question. Maybe it's more focused towards your presentation.
Yeah, I can give some examples, and if the positive discrimination policies are policies that try to integrate the minorities, the foreign women, and in general the people that are more disadvantaged. So this kind of politics can be employed, for example, from the intercultural associations, which try to include more these foreign women. So we have seen before the example of these associations, which have policies that are not considered positive discrimination policies because foreign women are not included in the policymaking processes and so on. And by adopting politics of positive discriminations, these women, but it can be not only women, it can be also other vulnerable subjects, are included even more in, for example, in practice in the directive corps of the associations or in other corps of other organizations. And for example, we can speak of positive discrimination politics, also in the case of politics that support the health of foreign women, so politics which are targeted only for foreign women to improve their wellness, and politics of inclusion in general.
Thank you very much, Marta. Well, we still have 5 more minutes to go, so we could maybe, if you want to, maybe express some concluding remarks, or maybe some something for the future. Like, for example, when Ragazza spoke about some hypotheses to be maybe researched on or maybe studied for the future. Maybe you want to conclude with maybe like a minute presentation, a minute speech or something. If you want to do it, we have time for that.
I think that the comparison will be very interesting about among our countries, and we have a lot of similarities, but also differences, and I think we can learn each other and transfer also tools and instruments and way of to do research, but also to implement practices. So I don't know.
If I may, I would like to add the fact that I really appreciate the way this conference was conceived, starting from a real theoretical perspective on the notion of race and racism, that it has to be recalled because it is extremely useful, and then also the fact that the institutional racism was really well taken into account, and then we have the chance also to go through different types of racism within unique logic, really well identified at the beginning of the conference by Maria Cosian-Guillard. So it was impressive how in these 2 days we have a chance to have this umbrella opening, and then the possibility to let's say appreciate how racism situated itself in different national contexts, because we are all European countries, but nonetheless there are important differences. And in this regard, I'm feeling, I'm afraid to see that Italy is really left behind if in comparison with other countries, but we also have to consider how frightening is the situation in the northern countries of Europe, where usually we assume that there are more, let's say, safe zone in regard of the issue we're talking about, but this is not what is happened to be now. So we really have as experts to keep high the attention on what is going on and do our best to confront ourselves and to talk and to try to find together the solution. So thanks a lot to the organizer and for the Multihuri project for this chance to meet and to reason together, because this is exactly what we have to do. So thanks for all the effort behind the conference. Thanks a lot.
Well, yeah, thank you very much, everyone. Grazie mille, Guia, Maria Grazia, and Marta. It was actually a pleasure to be here with you and moderating this session. We have learned a lot from your presentations. I agree with Albert. He mentioned that it was amazing presentations and complementary, and it's true. And I would also like to thank the technical staff behind the scenes for making it easy and smooth for me to moderate, and for their hard work during the whole Congress. And before you go, I will leave you now with Professor Ángeles Solanes, and she will do some closing remarks, concluding remarks. So, grazie mille. Thank you very much.
Bueno, muchas gracias. Felicidades a las ponentes. Congratulations. Unas últimas palabras, simplemente que sea el cierre del Congreso Multihuri, igual que lo abrimos. Quisiera en primer lugar agradecer a todas y a todos, ¿no? Agradecer al soporte técnico, lo acaba de decir también Nacho, a Ferran, a Priscila, a Didac, a María, que desde on-site han estado realizando un trabajo diligente, muy atento, de apoyo técnico, que nos ha facilitado muchísimo este congreso y que hubiera sido imposible sin ellos. Entonces, muchísimas gracias al trabajo que ha hecho on-site por apoyarnos técnicamente a lo largo de estos 2 días. Gracias también a las y los ponentes que han participado. Han podido ver ustedes que se trata de auténticos especialistas en cada una de las materias que hemos trabajado, y creo que todos hemos aprendido mucho, también con las discusiones que se han generado, con las preguntas a veces muy complicadas de responder. Y bueno, hemos avanzado dentro de esta familia que somos el equipo Multihuri, ¿no? Que intentamos sacar adelante este proyecto sobre racismo y discriminación, los derechos humanos bajo amenaza. Pues hemos intentado una vez más ahondar en esos temas que son tan difíciles, pero que exigen una gestión urgente vinculada al ámbito del racismo y la discriminación. Cómo no darles las gracias muy sinceramente a todos ustedes, a todas las personas que han asistido, que nos han ido acompañando a lo largo de estos 2 días intensos de Congreso Internacional, que además han puesto opiniones y referencias en las redes sociales, en el Twitter, en el Facebook, etcétera, que además le han dado una visibilidad al Congreso que sinceramente les agradecemos. Yo quería comentarles que desde el proyecto Multihuri, desde el grupo, nos gustaría que nos mandaran valoraciones del Congreso, si lo estiman oportuno, al correo que ya hemos dicho varias veces, multihuridh@gmail.com, comentarios, críticas también, si lo consideran oportuno, ideas, posibilidades de mejora, todo aquello que a nosotros nos ayude a crecer y a avanzar en este proyecto. Comentarles también que las grabaciones estarán disponibles, las grabaciones del Congreso, probablemente ya la semana que viene, estarán disponibles en el canal de YouTube que tiene el grupo Multihuri, y que si ustedes quieren seguir las actividades que nosotros vamos haciendo, pues lo pueden hacer a través de la página web multihuri.com, que ahí, bueno, pues colgamos en abierto todas las publicaciones que realizamos y que pueden colgarse en abierto. Algunas no es posible, pero la buena mayoría sí. Las entrevistas que nos hacen, por ejemplo, el artículo que sale hoy en el periódico a propósito del Congreso, que me entrevistó ayer a mediodía un periodista y ha recogido muchas de las ideas a propósito del Congreso. Los proyectos anteriores que hemos tenido también, los resultados a los cuales hemos llegado, todos estos resultados están en abierto y disponibles para cada una de las personas que puedan estar interesadas en la página web. Pueden también contactarnos, como ya se ha dicho en las distintas intervenciones, a través de nuestros respectivos correos. En el caso de las personas que estamos en la universidad, los correos institucionales son muy fáciles porque suelen ser nuestros nombres. Por ejemplo, el mío, angeles.solanes@uv.universidadvalencia.es, y así en la mayoría de casos de las universidades. Y si les apetece, pues también nos pueden seguir a través de Twitter, porque, bueno, ahí a través del Twitter intentamos pues mover todas las actividades que hacemos, que suelen ser como estas, actividades en abierto, y que nos encantaría que compartir, nos encantaría que compartieran con nosotras y con nosotros, pues para conseguir esa transferencia que es tan necesaria de las cuestiones que se realiza en el ámbito académico. Ustedes han podido ver a lo largo de estas sesiones de este Congreso Internacional lo importante que es prevenir y combatir las distintas formas de racismo, xenofobia y discriminación desde la dimensión jurídica, desde la dimensión social, y que para hacerlo es imprescindible la investigación y el desarrollo de conceptos y el análisis de la práctica, pero también es imprescindible el mayor protagonismo de las personas que son víctimas de estos ataques, de las posibles víctimas, de las personas que se dedican al ámbito del activismo, de todos los agentes, del conjunto de la sociedad civil, para que podamos construir entre todos mecanismos que nos permitan combatir este tipo de prácticas. El proyecto Multihuri, desde el Instituto de Derechos Humanos de la Universidad de Valencia y con todas las universidades que ya saben que lo integramos, seguiremos trabajando. Ya les anuncié al principio del Congreso en que ahora estábamos a mitad del proyecto, es decir, nos queda todavía un congreso final y algunos seminarios intermedios que iremos comunicando. Seguiremos trabajando para desarrollar propuestas de mecanismos institucionales, diseños de programas, de iniciativas de índole social, jurídica, política, que articulen un sistema, digamos, más sólido para afrontar esta necesidad imperiosa de reducir y eliminar el racismo, la xenofobia y la discriminación. Para ello queremos contar con ustedes, esperamos volver a contar con todos ustedes, con las personas que están interesadas en estos temas, para que podamos combatir efectivamente los discursos y los delitos de odio y facilitar el avance de un marco jurídico, pero también de una especial sensibilidad social que haga posible una mejor convivencia. Con el sincero agradecimiento de todos los que hemos participado en este congreso, me despido de todos ustedes y espero que podamos coincidir pronto en otro congreso que con un poco de suerte sea al menos híbrido y por tanto podamos tener ya una parte presencial. Muchas gracias.